This story does not open with slot machines ringing or someone screaming in a bank lobby. It starts with a perfectly ordinary morning. A bank employee in Madrid pours herself another cup of coffee. A woman in Hanoi squeezes in one last text to her kid before clocking in. A guy in New York wakes up his computer, logs into the system the same way he has 1,000 times before. None of them have any idea that somewhere, half a world away, someone is sitting in a dark room, eyes locked on their screens, watching every move they make. Outside, people line up at ATMs. They pull their jackets tighter, glance at their phones, mentally juggle rent, tuition, weekend dinners, gas, groceries. The bank is that one place they are taught to trust. You put your money there so you do not have to worry. That account is not just numbers. It is a future, a dream, maybe a way out of years of barely getting by. And then, at one very specific moment, something happens that looks nothing like a Hollywood heist. An ATM in Kyiv suddenly starts spitting out cash non-stop, even though no one has pressed a single button. A few minutes later, another machine in Moscow does the same thing. In Warsaw, a man stands in front of an ATM with empty hands, no card in the slot, no fingers on the keypad, while thick stacks of bills slide out like a magic trick gone wrong. Security cameras capture everything. No masks, no guns, no hostages on the floor, just money, pouring out of a system that everyone always assumed was sealed tight. Over the next few hours, scenes like this pop up in city after city. By the time anyone realizes it is not just a glitch, millions of dollars have already vanished. There is no bank robbery alarm, no smashed windows, no sirens racing through traffic. On paper, it still looks like an ordinary business day. At the headquarters of a major bank, a young manager leans closer to his monitor, frowning at a number that will not reconcile. He figures it is probably a software issue, an accounting error, maybe someone typed one digit wrong. On the other side of the world, a security engineer is trying to convince her boss that this is not just a bug. Meanwhile, regular customers simply see a few strange transactions on their accounts and are not even sure how worried they are supposed to be yet. We are used to picturing bank criminals as people in masks, yelling for everyone to get on the floor. But the crew in this story does not need to yell. They do not even need to show their faces. They only need one thing, and it is terrifyingly simple. They need the daily habits of the people who work inside the bank. The morning routines, the repeated clicks, the logins everyone does on autopilot, never imagining that someone might be watching over their shoulder. Every tiny action, every coffee break, every time a report is opened, becomes a clue, a pattern, a rhythm, and slowly, a hacking crew sitting far away starts to learn the heartbeat of the financial system itself. In the next part, we are going to ask a hard question. Who is patient enough and cold enough to sit for hours just watching other people work, and then turn those harmless little habits into a cross-continent bank heist, where more than 100 banks end up as victims without even realizing it is happening? And before we move on, if you are still here, it really helps the channel if you tap like and subscribe to Sins and Lessons. I am trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers, and every single click from you genuinely makes it easier to keep telling these stories. In thick, boring-looking cybersecurity reports, the name Carbanak first shows up as a cold little line of text. It sounds like a random piece of malware, just another virus in a long list of threats. But behind that name are very real people. Think of young guys growing up in the post-Soviet world, in concrete gray cities where talent with a computer can take you down two completely different roads. On one side, you become a regular developer, earn a modest paycheck, watch inflation eat away at it every year. On the other side, you step into the underground, where a single line of code can be worth more than your parents made in a decade. The name Carbanak did not just come out of nowhere. It is a mashup inspired by earlier pieces of malware that once shook the cybersecurity world. Things like Carburp and Ananak, tools that powered smaller, more scattered bank thefts. Carbanak was the evolution of that idea. It was not just code anymore. It was a whole organization behind the code. They thought like a company, operated like a company, but had exactly one mission: pull money out of the global financial system and make it theirs. Imagine a group of people who are not cartoon supervillains, but very smart technical minds born in the wrong place at the wrong time. They understand networks better than most banks do. They see every little crack that busy people overlook. They know that if they stay on the right side, they will spend their lives building software for small firms and fighting to stay afloat. If they cross the line, those same skills can turn them into invisible bosses. Carbanak was never about one lone genius. It was a structure. Roles were clear. Some members focused on building and constantly updating the malware so it could slip past antivirus tools. Others studied how banks operate on the inside. They read internal training manuals, watched demo videos, learned how staff were supposed to move through the systems. Then you had the people in charge of moving and cleaning the money. They set up shell companies, fake accounts, and hired cash-out crews scattered around the world. Their meetings did not happen in glass boardrooms. They happened on hidden forums and encrypted chats, under usernames you could never tie to a real face. Yet the way they worked would feel familiar to anyone who has ever worked at a startup. There were projects, deadlines, responsibilities, payouts. Only the product was crime. What really sets Carbanak apart is the way they thought about that crime. They were done with stealing random credit card numbers or scamming a few $100s at a time from normal people. They asked a much sharper question. Why waste energy picking off customers one by one, when you could rob the place that holds everybody's money? They saw themselves almost like process optimizers for crime. Instead of touching millions of small accounts, they aimed straight at the heart of the bank, the core banking systems, the wires, the international payment rails. If they could speak the language of those systems well enough, they did not need to touch customers at all. To pull that off, they had to behave like a shadow business. There was a budget. There were profit shares. Someone was in charge of recruiting new partners. They looked for people already buried in debt and used them as fronts for companies, as account holders in different countries. They paid the folks who physically withdrew cash just a small cut, like paying frontline employees, while the real decision makers stayed far away, hidden behind screens and layers of intermediaries. It all sounds cold and calculated, and in many ways it is. But if you zoom in from a human angle, you also see a mess of ambition, frustration, and unfairness. These are countries that went through deep economic crises, places where people can have degrees and still fail to find decent work. Kids who grew up with the internet as their first language, but feel like the global financial system was never built with them in mind. That does not excuse what they did. Not even close. But it does help explain why a group like this decided to go to war with banks instead of applying to work inside one. In the underground, Carbanak became a name people spoke with a weird kind of respect. The way you talk about a powerful brand. If legit companies brag about user numbers and revenue, Carbanak was measured by how many banks they had successfully compromised, how many countries they had pulled money from without getting caught. More than 100 banks became pins on their invisible scoreboard. Each pin was millions of dollars gone, sleepless nights for risk managers, and a hit to the fragile trust of regular people who thought their savings were safe. But maybe the most terrifying part is not the amount of money. It is the message behind it. Carbanak proved something uncomfortable. If you understand how an organization works deeply enough, if you understand its habits, its rhythms, its blind spots, you can manipulate that entire system without ever walking through the front door. And in the next part, we will look at one of the quiet weapons they used to do exactly that. Not some sci-fi super virus, but something that looks almost exactly like the work emails you open every single morning. If you open your work inbox every morning, you already know this scene. Dozens of emails waiting. Internal announcements, reports, updates, attachments. You click through them on autopilot, sip your coffee, hit download without thinking too much about it. At one of the banks in this story, that is exactly how it started. An employee received an email that looked completely normal. The subject line said something about a security update. The sender's name matched the tech department. The company logo sat neatly at the top. The tone was textbook corporate. Polite, professional, just urgent enough to make him feel like he should handle it right away. Inside was an attachment. Maybe a Word document with installation instructions. Maybe an Excel file. Maybe a tiny installer described as a new security patch. The employee moved his mouse over the download button. In his mind, this was the kind of thing anyone in his position would do. He honestly believed he was helping keep the system safer, doing his job as a responsible bank employee. But on the other side of the world, this was the moment the Carbanak crew had been patiently preparing for. Before hitting send, they had spent hours studying the bank's internal email style. They collected real email samples, copied every signature, every greeting, every way managers like to phrase things. They knew that for the trick to work, that message had to look exactly like the ones employees saw every single day. This was not random spam blasted out to thousands of strangers. This was spear phishing, a spear, not a net. One target, one role. They did their homework. Who usually handles system updates? Who has permission to install software? Who often works late? They dug through social media crumbs, job posts, leaked contact lists. They were not trying to fool the entire company. They just needed to fool the one person standing at the gate. When the employee double-clicked the file, there was no loud warning, no flashing red skull, just a tiny pop-up asking for permission. One quiet breath, one quick click, and that was it. For him, it was just another box checked in a long day of tasks. For Carbanak, that click was the front door swinging wide open. The malware did not make the screen flicker or crash. It just sat there. It recorded every keystroke, every password, every login. It searched for a way to reach outside the network and report back. Somewhere in a dark room in another country, the hackers received a signal. The malware had taken root inside the bank's internal systems. Now, from miles away, they could peer into a building they had never physically entered. On the employee's side, nothing looked broken. His computer still worked. He replied to emails, sent reports, maybe squeezed in a quick call to his mom during a break, then packed up and went home. He had no idea that behind every normal action, a pair of invisible eyes was watching. If he noticed the computer running a little slower, it was easy to blame it on office computers always being like that. Nothing that felt serious enough to raise a flag. Over the next few days, the malware quietly spread. It jumped through shared accounts, overly broad permissions, forgotten machines that were still plugged into the network. It moved closer and closer to the sensitive servers that controlled accounting systems, transaction processing, ATMs. From one tiny click that took a few seconds, an entire bank was slowly turning into a house where every door could now be unlocked from the outside. What hits people the hardest in this story is that part. That employee was not a criminal. He was not reckless or lazy. He was just like millions of people trying to get through their day, trying to keep up with work, trusting that internal emails are safe, trusting that security is something the IT department has already handled. Carbanak understood those small human assumptions, and they built an entire operation on top of that very ordinary trust. In the next part, we will see what happens when the crew is no longer standing outside the walls, when they are deep inside the network, sitting for weeks just watching bank staff work, memorizing every tiny habit, and then using that exact rhythm to steal money without ever pulling a gun or walking through a bank's front door. Once Carbanak's malware had its hooks deep inside the bank's network, they did not rush. They did not immediately move money or take over ATMs. They did something that sounds boring on the surface, but is actually the creepiest part of the whole story. They sat down and watched, like they were binge-watching a secret reality show about office life. On the hackers' screens, you could not see anyone's face. All they saw was a mouse cursor moving, windows opening and closing, password boxes being filled in so fast, they had to rewind the recording to catch each character. But behind those clicks was somebody's entire life. A woman who shows up every morning, hangs her coat on the back of her chair, and logs into the core banking system. Day 1, the Carbanak crew just watched her. They wrote down what time she logged in, which window appeared first, what apps she opened before everything else. Around 8:30, the internal login screen popped up. She typed her username, her password, then opened the software she used to check pending transactions. Nothing dramatic, just routine, again and again. And that routine, that repetition, was exactly what they needed. Day 2 looked the same. Same login time, same flow. She opened her internal email, replied to a few quick messages, then switched over to the payments system. The hackers noticed she always checked the same list first, always clicked through options in the exact same order. Step by step, They documented her habits until they could basically predict her next click with their eyes closed. Behind her screen, she might be thinking about rent, about a loan for her kids' education, about her parents back home. On the other side, the people watching her did not see any of that. To them, she was one thing: the person who could touch the money, the one who could open the door to the system they wanted to own. One side is just trying to live a decent life. The other is turning that effort into an opportunity to exploit. And she was not the only one being watched. Carbanak had multiple remote sessions open at once. They watched a manager approve large transfers. They watched a systems engineer log into critical servers. They watched an accountant go through end-of-day reports. Each person was just one slice of the picture. Put together, all those slices turned into a detailed map of how the bank really worked. From those hours of observation, they built their own internal playbook, not an employee training manual, a crime training manual. Page 1, how to log into core banking. Page 2, how to get into the ATM control system. Next pages, step-by-step instructions for sending international transfers. Any action they saw repeated often enough became a rule. And once something is a rule, it can be copied. What really makes people's skin crawl is not just that the screens were being watched. It is the feeling that privacy was peeled away without anyone noticing. Those little moments when a staff member sneaks in a quick search for schools for their kid, checks news from their hometown, or logs into their own personal account for a minute, all of that could be seen by a stranger somewhere far away. The employees thought they were sitting safely inside a secure office, with keycards and cameras and guards downstairs. But the real door had already been opened the moment that first malicious click happened. The bank staff in this story were doing exactly what they were trained to do. They showed up. They worked hard. They followed procedure. They just did not realize that their consistency made them predictable. Carbanak did not need to crack some mythical unbreakable algorithm. They just needed to memorize human habits and then play that role convincingly in front of the system. And once that invisible playbook was thick enough, the crew knew they were ready. They knew when employees were least alert. They knew which actions could fly under the radar. They knew exactly who to pretend to be, on which account, at what time of day, so that everything would look like just another normal workday. That is the moment when this quiet, silent watching phase was about to turn into a full-on heist, with ATMs, wire transfers, and the core banking system itself being pulled like puppets on strings from somewhere far, far away. By this point, Carbanak was not just lurking behind the glass anymore. They knew the rhythm of the bank the way a veteran employee does. They knew when people logged in, when approvals happened, when everyone mentally checked out for the day. And then they did something bold. They logged into the system as if they worked there. No masks, no guns, just a keyboard, stolen credentials, and a frighteningly deep understanding of human routine. The first move is what investigators later called cashing out through ATMs. Carbanak used the accounts and access they had stolen to quietly tap into the systems that controlled cash machines. In a lot of banks, those back-end tools were designed so staff could remotely update settings, do maintenance, or take machines offline if needed. For the hackers, that dashboard was basically a remote control for turning entire cities into cash-out playgrounds. They set schedules for ATMs across different neighborhoods and cities so that, at a very specific time, those machines would start spitting out cash with no card and no PIN required. Then they brought in a small army of people the police would later label as mules. In real life, most of them were just folks buried in debt, desperate for quick money. Their job was almost insultingly simple. Show up at the right ATM at the right time, stand there, take the money, and melt back into the crowd. Picture a cold Saturday night on a quiet street. A young guy pulls his hood up, stands in front of an ATM with empty hands. No card in the slot, no fingers on the keypad. Suddenly, the cash tray pops open and stack after stack of bills drops out, like an invisible hand inside the machine is feeding him. On the bank's security cameras, all you really see is one person standing in the right place at the right time. The real commands are coming from some dark room 1,000 miles away. The second move played out on the international payment system most customers never think about by name: SWIFT. For regular people, SWIFT is just that mysterious thing hidden behind the international transfer button. For banks, it is the bloodstream that connects them to the rest of the financial world. After weeks of watching screens and recording sessions, Carbanak learned exactly how staff created wire transfers. They picked up the language, how transactions were described so they looked normal, what amounts blended in, which counterparties showed up all the time and raised zero eyebrows. Then they started crafting their own Swift messages using those same patterns. They sent money to intermediary accounts overseas, usually companies that existed only on paper or small banks with loose controls. On a supervisor's dashboard, these transfers looked like just another part of the daily flow. No crazy numbers, no descriptions that screamed scam. The cruel part is that everything happened during business hours, through legitimate accounts, following the same procedures the bank had carefully designed to be safe. The only difference was who was following the procedure. This time, the person dutifully clicking through was the attacker. By the time anyone spotted the trail, the money had already washed through multiple layers of accounts. It was withdrawn as cash or pushed into assets that do not show up neatly on a bank statement. By then, the original transfer might as well have been smoke. The third move went straight for the core banking system, the heart that keeps all the numbers in sync. Here, Carbanak did not always have to move money out right away. Sometimes, they simply changed what the system believed to be true. They edited balances so that everything looked fine on paper, even though real money was already gone. For example, they could quietly increase the internal balance of a technical or house account, then use that account to pull money out through ATMs or internal transfers over the course of the day. At the end of the day, they would tweak the numbers again so the reports all balanced. The ledger looked clean. The internal checks passed. Meanwhile, the actual cash was already in the hands of people no one could name. And behind every single line of code and every number they tampered with, there were real people stuck with the fallout. A manager jolted awake by a late-night call from the risk team, feeling their stomach drop when they hear the phrase multi-million-dollar discrepancy. An employee sitting in a tense conference room, staring at a projection full of red figures, wondering how their normal, everyday clicks could possibly be connected to this chaos. Families watching the news about their bank experiencing an incident, quietly worrying if the savings they have built over years are still safe. Carbanak proved something brutal. If you understand how an organization really works, you can borrow its own hands to punch itself in the face. You do not have to kick down doors, cut the power, or blow open vaults. You just have to speak the same language the system was programmed to trust. And for a long time, the system trusted them more than it trusted the vague gut feelings of the humans inside it. But like every big crime story, tiny cracks eventually started to show. In the next part, we are going to look at this whole thing from the inside, through the eyes of the people in those banks, who were the first to feel that something was wrong in those supposedly perfect numbers, and how they slowly pieced together the pattern that would eventually be called Carbanak. For a long time, everything happened in silence. The money did not vanish in one big crash. It leaked out slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a rock. No alarms blaring, just a few strange numbers here and there, and that uneasy feeling in the gut of people who stare at spreadsheets all day. At a bank in Eastern Europe, a reconciliation specialist paused his mouse over a transaction just a second longer than usual. The amount was not huge. The description looked fine, but something about it felt off, so he flagged it anyway. At a bank in Asia, a branch manager replayed ATM footage after a cash shortage. The camera clearly showed someone standing at the machine when the money went missing. But when they checked the system, there was no record of any transaction at that time. Looked at one by one, these moments are easy to brush aside. Someone sighs and labels them software glitches, rare accounting errors, weird one-offs. In a workplace that is constantly short on time, where inboxes are overflowing and meetings never end, those fragile little instincts often get folded up, shoved into a mental drawer, and forgotten. It was only when someone started adding all those little glitches together that the real picture started to show. Tens of millions of dollars, then hundreds of millions, slipping away across different banks on different continents. At that point, nobody could keep calling it an internal hiccup. Cybersecurity firms were brought in. International investigators started sharing data across borders, putting reports side by side that, at first glance, seemed to have nothing to do with each other. In conference rooms in Europe, the United States, and Asia, people spread out system logs and malware samples on big screens. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to click into place. The same family of malware buried deep inside internal networks. The same style of bait emails sent to exactly the right employees. The same patient screen recording of staff going about their day. The same quiet control over ATMs and wire transfers, all disguised as totally normal banking work. A pattern emerged. Silent, but sharp, like a pencil sketch being traced over again and again until the lines turned dark and undeniable. The name Carbanak started showing up in official reports and heavy, uncomfortable internal meetings. For a lot of employees, that was the moment things finally made sense. Those weird incidents at their branch were not isolated screw-ups. They were tiny parts of a much bigger story. They were not the only ones who had messed up. They were just one small dot on a world map full of victims. The emotions were mixed. A bit of relief because at least there was now an explanation. And at the same time, a deep sting of guilt. The realization that rushed clicks, ignored gut feelings, and choosing deadlines over doubt had accidentally opened the door for criminals who never even had to walk into the building. Once the full Carbanak pattern was drawn, the financial world had to ask itself a hard question. How much have we spent on firewalls and shiny security software? And how little have we invested in the humans sitting in front of the screens? And in the final part, we are going to talk about those hard-earned lessons, about how our daily habits can either be a shield that protects us or an open door inviting trouble in, depending on how we build them. By the time the name Carbanak was clearly spelled out in official reports, this was no longer just a story about a few faraway banks. It hit something a lot closer to home for all of us. It is that feeling of trusting a system, trusting a big institution, trusting that familiar login screen you see every day, and then realizing those same familiar things can be turned around and used to hurt you. For the banks, Carbanak was like a slap in the face, a brutal wake-up call. They realized that firewalls, antivirus software, shiny command centers, and security dashboards are not enough if the people on the front lines are exhausted, rushed, and convinced that security is someone else's job. So they started over. They retrained staff. They rewrote procedures. They split up access so no one person could touch too much. They were told to take small anomalies seriously, not just shrug them off as noise. But the lesson does not stop with banks. For the rest of us, whether we work in finance or just use a debit card and online banking, this story is a reminder that attackers are not always more advanced than we are. A lot of the time, they are just more patient. They watch how we move. They know we click too fast. They know we ignore that weird feeling in our gut. They know we do not want to slow things down by asking one more question. One careless click can snowball into sleepless nights, investigations, painful meetings, and reputations on the line. But that is only one side of the story. The other side is that human beings, with their instincts and their willingness to speak up, also played a huge role in uncovering the Carbanak pattern and stopping it. Nobody is perfect. Everybody misses things. But when enough people are willing to pause, to look twice at a strange transaction, to say, hey, this does not feel right, the whole system has a much better chance of staying safe. If you have made it this far into the episode, chances are you care about stories like this. Stories where crime collides with consequence, where behind every headline there are real people with real flaws, real choices, and very real costs. That is exactly why this channel, Sins and Lessons, exists, to tell these stories in a way that feels human and honest, not just technical. If this episode gave you something to think about, do me a small favor. Hit like so the algorithm knows this is worth sharing, and subscribe to Sins and Lessons so you do not miss the next deep dive into a heist that sounds like a movie but is 100% real. Hopefully, each time we do this, we walk away with one small lesson that helps us live just a little more awake in a world that is not as safe as the login screen wants us to believe.